prison echoed with a suffocating silence as a man in a bright orange jumpsuit sat alone on the edge of his cot. His hands were trembling, his eyes were hollow, staring at the concrete floor as he counted down the final hours of his life. Tomorrow was his execution. No family visited him. No friends waited outside the gates holding signs of protest. The world had already forgotten him. But before he died, he asked the warden for just one final wish, a request so strange, so unexpected, that it shocked every officer who heard it. He didn't ask for a steak dinner. He didn't ask for a priest to forgive his sins. He didn't even ask for freedom. He asked to see his dog one last time. The guards thought it was foolish. Some laughed. Others thought he was losing his mind. The officers expected a tearful, emotional reunion between a man and his pet. But when the dog finally entered the room, everything changed. Instead of running to his master with love, Shadow, the retired police dog, began barking desperately, ferociously, not at the prisoner, but at someone else in the room. The officers froze in terror. No one understood what was happening. But moments later, a truth exploded that shook the entire prison to its core. Stay with us, because this story will leave you absolutely speechless. But before we unlock the secrets of this case, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And really, I'm curious about our community. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country's name in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. The prison felt different that morning, heavier, quieter, as if the concrete walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Dawn had barely touched the razor wire fences outside, yet the corridors buzzed with an unease no one dared to name. Officers moved with stiff shoulders, exchanging glances that carried questions none of them wanted to ask out loud. Today wasn't routine. Today wasn't normal. Today was the kind of day that left a scar on your soul. Down the long central hallway, the metallic echo of boots striking the floor sounded sharper than usual, colder. Every step drew closer to death row, where a single cell waited in suffocating silence. Behind its steel bars sat a man whose fate was already sealed. Luke Turner, former police officer, former war hero, former K-9 handler. Now, he was just inmate number 4721, scheduled for execution at sundown. But it wasn't the execution that had the whole prison unsettled. Executions were brutal, but they were predictable. Everyone followed procedure, everyone did their job, and everyone went home with their conscience tucked safely behind the rulebook. This time was different. Luke Turner had made a final request. One last wish before his life ended. Not the usual. No phone call to a mother, no final meal from a fancy restaurant. Instead, he asked for something no one in the history of this prison had ever heard before. He wanted to see his retired police dog, Shadow, a request so unusual that even the warden had stood silent for nearly a full minute after reading the paper. A request so unexpected that the officers gathered in small clusters near the coffee machine, whispering theories. Was Luke trying to escape? Was he trying to smuggle something in using the dog? Or was this simply the desperate plea of a man who had nothing left in this world except memories of the only partner who had never betrayed him? As the sun crept higher in the sky, the tension in the air thickened like smoke. The warden signed the approval unwillingly, his pen scratching across the paper like a reluctant verdict. Word spread quickly through the cell blocks. Guards stopped mid-task. Inmates pressed their ears to the bars, listening to the gossip. Even the prison dogs in the facility's own K-9 unit barked restlessly in their kennels, sensing a shift in the atmosphere without knowing why. It felt like the entire building leaned toward the clock on the wall, listening to the slow, relentless ticking of time. 12 hours left until execution. 12 hours left before the reunion. 12 hours until a truth, long buried, long ignored, would break open and shatter everything they believed about Luke Turner, about justice, and about the dog who once saved countless lives. No one knew it yet, but this wasn't the beginning of an ending. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, something life-changing, and the countdown had already begun. Luke Turner sat on the edge of his narrow cot, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers interlocked so tightly the knuckles had turned white. The cold air of the cell brushed against his skin, but he barely felt it. He was numb. For months he had lived inside this concrete box. Yet today it felt smaller than ever, like the walls were slowly closing in to crush him. His execution day, a day he had replayed in his mind 1,000 times in his nightmares. Some nights he accepted it. Other nights he fought it with silent screams no one ever heard. But no matter how many times he tried to prepare himself, nothing made the reality any easier. Around his neck hung a worn metal tag. It was Shadow's old K9 ID tag, the only possession he'd been allowed to keep in his cell. Every time his fingers brushed against the cold metal, memories hit him with the force of a physical punch. Memories of a life before the handcuffs, before the orange jumpsuit, before the shame. Once he had been respected, admired, a decorated officer known for his bravery and loyalty, a man who walked into danger without hesitation because he knew he had a partner who would never question a single command. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a shield, a compass. And sometimes the only thing Luke trusted in the darkest hours of the night. They had been inseparable until everything changed. Luke took a slow, shaky breath, staring at the cracks in the floor, letting his thoughts drift back to the night that destroyed his life. The night he was accused of murdering a detective within his own department. A detective who had been caught in a corruption scandal. A detective Luke had argued with just hours before the killing took place. The evidence had pointed directly at him. Too directly. Fingerprints on the door handle, a weapon found under the seat of his car. A witness who claimed Luke had threatened the victim in the parking lot. Shadow had barked relentlessly the night of the murder, refusing to leave Luke's side, pulling at his leash, sensing a turmoil Luke himself couldn't explain. But dogs couldn't testify in court. Loyalty couldn't overturn forensic evidence, and Luke's world collapsed faster than he could defend himself. At his trial, he had watched his former colleagues refuse to make eye contact. He watched jurors shift uncomfortably under the weight of his stare. He watched his reputation burn to ashes in the headlines of every newspaper. The sentence had come down swiftly. Death, an ending sealed by lies, secrets, and something worse, betrayal. Since then, Luke had lived in torment, trapped between memories of who he once was and the nightmare of who the world believed him to be. But today, there was one sliver of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not hope for himself. He had accepted his fate. But hope that seeing Shadow one last time might give him the strength to face the end with dignity. He closed his eyes, feeling the metal tag between his fingers one last time. "Just one more moment with you, buddy," he whispered to the empty cell. Just one. He didn't know that Shadow wasn't coming for a goodbye. Shadow was coming to save his life. Shadow stood in the center of the K9 training yard, miles away from the prison, the morning light brushing across his graying muzzle. Age had softened his once razor-sharp features, but nothing could dull the intensity in his amber eyes. Even in retirement, he carried himself with the alertness of a soldier who had never truly left the battlefield. His ears twitched at every sound. His stance was strong, his breath steady. an old warrior still ready for duty. Handlers passing through the yard paused to look at him. Some shook their heads, whispering about the strange request that had come from death row. Others simply watched him with a mix of respect and unease. Shadow wasn't just any retired K9. He was a legend, a dog whose service record held more bravery than most humans could dream of. But today, something about him was different. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't training. He wasn't relaxing in the shade like he usually did. Instead, he sat completely still, eyes fixed on the metal gate as if waiting for a command from someone who hadn't spoken to him in years. When Officer Ramirez approached with a heavy leather leash in hand, Shadow didn't move. He simply shifted his weight, his tail lowering, his ears angling forward. He knew something was happening, something big. Dogs didn't understand human laws or court sentences or executions, but they understood fear. They understood loss. And more than anything, they understood when someone they loved was hurting. Shadow had sensed it the moment the call came in, the minute a guard's voice echoed across the yard saying Luke Turner's name. Shadow's body tensed. His breathing changed. His eyes widened as if a door inside him had suddenly reopened. Ramirez knelt beside him, gently clipping the leash to his old worn collar. "Easy, boy," he murmured, stroking the dog's head. "They're taking you to the prison for a visit." His voice softened, filled with pity. "Your old partner asked for you. It's his last request." Shadow's chest rose and fell in a slow, heavy breath. At the sound of the word partner, he lowered his head slightly, an instinctive gesture of recognition. He hadn't seen Luke in years, but the bond they once shared hadn't aged the way their bodies had. Some connections refuse to break, even when the world forces them apart. As Ramirez led him toward the armored transport vehicle, Shadow moved with surprising speed for his age. His paws struck the ground with purpose. His tail lifted slightly, not in excitement, but determination. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know why, but he knew one truth with absolute certainty. Luke needed him, and no matter what awaited them inside that prison, Shadow was ready. Warden Harris stood at the window of his office, staring at the empty prison yard below as the morning light crawled across the concrete. His coffee sat untouched on the desk, going cold as the weight of a decision pressed harder against his chest. He had been in this job for 22 years. He had signed off on transfers, disciplinary actions, investigations, even executions. But nothing had ever unsettled him like the piece of paper lying in front of him now. Luke Turner's final request. A request so uncommon that Harris had read it 3 times just to make sure it wasn't a mistake. Last wishes were usually predictable. Family visits, a special meal, a letter, a prayer. But this was different. Luke wanted to see his retired K9 partner, a dog, a police-trained German shepherd who hadn't stepped inside this prison in years. Harris rubbed his temples, replaying Luke's file in his mind. The former officer had once been everything the department admired: disciplined, loyal, fearless. Then he had become everything the justice system condemned: a convicted murderer, a fallen hero, a man sentenced to die. Warden. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Deputy Warden Collins stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Her face held the same concern he felt. "The transport team is waiting. They need your approval to bring the dog into the restricted block." Harris exhaled slowly. "I know. You don't have to approve it," Collins reminded him carefully. "It breaks protocol. And honestly, it's risky. A K9 in a confined room with an inmate, especially 12 hours from execution. Anything could happen. The dog could be unpredictable. The inmate could be unstable." Harris nodded. The doubts were valid. The risks very real. But something inside him resisted the idea of denying the request. He remembered Luke's eyes during the trial, haunted, distant, almost broken. And he remembered the testimonies about that dog, the stories officers shared of the bond between the two. Shadow had saved Luke's life more than once. Luke had carried him out of explosions, gunfire, burning buildings. If there was one thing Luke Turner had ever loved without question, it was that dog. "Collins," Harris said finally, his voice low, "I've denied many things in my life, but I won't deny a man his last moment of peace. So, you're approving it?" Harris picked up his pen. The signature line stared back at him, waiting. He signed. The ink dried like a verdict. "Bring the dog in," he said quietly, "but keep full security inside the room. I want 6 guards. No chances." Collins hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Warden." As she left, Harris whispered to himself, "Let this be the right decision." He had no idea it would become the decision that unraveled everything he thought he knew. Word traveled faster than the morning shift could settle in. By the time the first round of cell checks ended, every guard, from rookies barely 6 months in to veterans with gray creeping into their sideburns, had heard the same unbelievable sentence. "They're bringing a retired police dog into death row." The reaction was immediate. In the break room, Officer Grady nearly choked on his coffee. "A dog in with a condemned inmate? Has everyone lost their minds?" Officer Bell, leaning on the counter, shrugged. "It's his last request." "What's the harm?" "The harm?" Grady snapped. "He's a former cop who killed another cop. You think he won't try something? These K-9 handlers are trained differently. You give him that dog, he might think he's getting a second chance. Or a weapon." Officer Patel, quieter and more thoughtful, shook his head. "Luke Turner never resisted, never fought, never caused trouble in here. If anything, he's been the calmest inmate we've ever had." Grady snorted. "Calm doesn't mean innocent. It means calculating." On the far side of the room, Officer Daniels listened but kept his gaze fixed on the wall. He had worked in the K-9 unit years ago. He knew what those partnerships meant. Watching a man ask to see the dog who trusted him more than anyone else. It stirred something inside him he didn't want to admit. Meanwhile, down the hall, a different kind of whisper spread among the guards escorting medical rounds. "You think the dog will even recognize him after all these years? Who knows? I heard that dog saved Luke's life 3 times. Yeah, didn't save him from the electric chair, though." The atmosphere turned sharper as guards lined the corridors leading to the visitation wing. Some were skeptical, others uneasy. But a few, just a few, felt something else. Pity. Luke Turner wasn't violent in prison. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He walked quietly, spoke respectfully, and lived as if he carried a burden he couldn't let go. Officer Ramirez from the K-9 unit arrived at the main gate with Shadow, and every guard went silent. Seeing the dog, older, slower, but still powerful, shifted the room's energy instantly. His coat was rougher now, his gait deliberate, but his eyes, those eyes, still held the same fierce intelligence. Shadow sniffed the air, ears lifting slightly. When he stepped forward, a strange hush fell over the guards, as though they instinctively understood they were witnessing something sacred. Even Grady swallowed hard. Ramirez tightened his grip on the leash. Luke's waiting. A few guards exchanged uneasy glances. Some feared this reunion, some doubted it, but none of them expected what the dog would reveal. And none of them knew that one of their own guards had a reason to fear this moment more than the inmate did. Years before Luke Turner became inmate 4721, before the courtroom whispers and the cold weight of handcuffs, he had stood tall in a different uniform, his police vest strapped tight, boots coated in dust, and Shadow trotting faithfully at his side. Their partnership wasn't just built on training, it was forged in fire, danger, and moments that left scars both visible and hidden. Luke remembered the first day he met Shadow, a young, restless German shepherd with golden eyes that missed nothing. While other dogs lunged or barked at new handlers, Shadow had simply stared at Luke, head tilted, judging him with a kind of intelligence Luke had never seen in an animal before. The trainer chuckled. "He chooses his own partner," he warned. "Let's see if he chooses you." He did. Shadow walked straight to Luke, sat politely, and pressed his head against Luke's leg. From that moment, they were never apart. Training days were grueling. Long hours under the sun, tracks through mud and forest, simulated gunshots, scent detection exercises, high-stress drills where failure wasn't an option. But whether it was a burning warehouse or a dark alley, Shadow stayed glued to Luke's command. Fierce when needed, gentle when required, fearless always, and the missions, those were etched into Luke's soul. There was the night in the abandoned factory when a hidden suspect lunged out of the shadows with a knife. Luke hadn't even seen the blade until Shadow slammed into the man, knocking him off balance and taking a deep cut along his side. Luke carried the bleeding dog in his arms all the way to the patrol car, whispering, "Stay with me, buddy, stay with me." Shadow survived. Then there was the hostage standoff at the gas station. A terrified little girl trapped inside while an armed man paced near the aisles. Luke remembered the tension, the countdown, the hostage-taker's trembling hands. When Luke whispered, "Shadow, go!" the dog burst through the side entrance like lightning, tackling the man before he could fire. The girl ran into Luke's arms, crying into his vest. Shadow saved them both. But the memory Luke replayed most often was the explosion. A meth lab raid gone wrong, a sudden ignition, a blast that threw Luke backward and sent flames roaring across the floor. He was dazed, ears ringing, barely conscious. When he opened his eyes, he saw a shadow dragging him by the vest, pulling him inch by inch toward the exit. Smoke choked the air. Debris rained down, but the dog refused to stop. Shadow saved his life again that night. Luke blinked back the sting of emotion, staring at the cold floor of his cell now. Those memories were all he had left, moments of loyalty, courage, and a bond deeper than most people ever understood. People had abandoned Luke. The justice system had condemned him. Friends had turned their backs. But Shadow never had. Even after retirement, Luke had visited him whenever he could until the trial shattered everything. Shadow was placed with another handler, and Luke disappeared behind bars. Yet the bond had never broken. Luke knew that when Shadow walked into that prison today, he wouldn't see inmate 4721. He would see his partner, his friend, his family. And what Luke didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that Shadow remembered something from the night of the crime. Something no one else saw, something that would change everything. The night everything changed wasn't stormy or dramatic. It was painfully ordinary. Quiet streets, cold sidewalks, a thin fog settling over the city like a final warning no one noticed. Luke Turner remembered every detail, not because he wanted to, but because he had replayed it in his mind thousands of times, searching for the one moment everything went wrong. He and Shadow had just finished a long shift. Drug sweep, traffic stop, a domestic call that ended peacefully. Luke was exhausted, his shoulders tight, his mind heavy. All he wanted was to go home, give Shadow his favorite treat, and sleep. But then the call came in. Officer down. Detective Miller. Suspect fleeing. Nearby units respond immediately. Luke froze. Detective Miller. A man he had argued with earlier that day. A man whose frustration had turned into threats. A man who believed Luke was standing in the way of something he wanted desperately to hide. Luke radioed in and sped toward the location, Shadow already bracing himself, ears alert. The streets blurred past. Something felt Wrong. Too wrong. When he arrived at the old warehouse district, there were no sirens, no officers, no movement, just silence, and Detective Miller's car parked crookedly near a dark alley. Shadow jumped from the vehicle the second Luke opened the door. His nose twitched, tail stiff. Luke followed, gun drawn, heart pounding. He expected a suspect, a struggle, anything but what he actually found. Miller lay on the ground, motionless, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Luke rushed forward. "Miller, talk to me. Hey, stay with me." But the detective's eyes were already empty. Shadow circled the body, then suddenly growled. A deep, unnatural sound Luke had never heard from him before. The dog was tense, alert, sniffing aggressively, moving toward the shadows of the alley. Luke followed his line of sight, but the alley was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. He radioed for backup, his voice shaking. Within minutes, officers swarmed the scene, flashing lights, cameras, evidence markers, shouts. Luke tried to explain what happened, but as the minutes stretched into hours, the atmosphere shifted. Questions became suspicious. Statements twisted. Evidence appeared that shouldn't have been there. A gun wiped clean except for Luke's prints, found in his truck. A witness claiming they saw Luke arguing with Miller earlier. Body cam footage mysteriously corrupted. Luke's protests grew more desperate, but the harder he fought, the more the case tightened around him like a noose. Officers he once trusted avoided his gaze. Shadows replaced truth. Quiet conversations ended when he walked into rooms. Shadow sensed everything. The dog stayed pressed against Luke's leg during interrogations, growling at specific officers, especially one, Officer Dalton, a man who had worked closely with Miller, a man who never met Luke's eyes, a man who always left the room when Shadow focused on him. But the court didn't care about a dog's instincts. They cared about the gun, the fingerprints, the motive they invented. And the night Luke was convicted, he watched Shadow struggle against the leash, barking wildly as Luke was dragged away. He didn't know it then, but Shadow had seen the real killer. Shadow had smelled the truth. And today, in that prison, the past they tried to bury was coming back, one growl at a time. Shadow's paws clicked against the polished prison floor, each step echoing down the hallway like a countdown. Officers walking beside him exchanged uneasy glances. The retired K-9 moved with purpose, head low, ears forward, breath steady. But something about him felt sharper. Older or not, Shadow was alert in a way that made every guard straighten instinctively. As they approached the restricted wing, Ramirez gave the leash a gentle tug. "Easy, boy. We're almost there." Shadow didn't respond. He wasn't listening to Ramirez anymore. His nose twitched rapidly, picking up scents layered in the walls. Metal, concrete, sweat, fear. But then, all at once, he froze. Not slowed, not hesitated. He completely stopped. The guards halted too, exchanging confused looks. "What's wrong with him?" one muttered. Shadow didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his head slowly, his pupils narrowing to thin amber slits. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, so deep it barely sounded like a growl, more like a warning rising from some place ancient inside him. Ramirez knelt quickly. "Shadow! Hey, what is it, buddy?" But Shadow wasn't looking at Ramirez. He was staring straight down the hallway. And at the other end of it stood Officer Dalton. Dalton had just turned the corner, clipboard in hand, pretending to be calm. But the moment he saw Shadow staring at him, his entire body stiffened. His grip tightened on the clipboard. His jaw clenched. For half a second, just half, fear flickered across his face before he masked it with forced irritation. "What's wrong with that dog?" Dalton snapped, his voice sharper than usual. Shadow growled louder, muscles coiling as if preparing to strike. Every guard exchanged uneasy looks now. Not because Shadow was growling, but because Shadow didn't growl at just anyone. He never had, not even during training days. When he growled, it meant one thing. He recognized a threat. Dalton cleared his throat, forcing a laugh. The mutt probably doesn't remember anything. It's been years. But his voice wavered. Shadow took one step forward. Dalton took one back. Ramirez tightened the leash, startled. "Shadow, easy." The dog ignored him. His gaze locked onto Dalton like a missile locking onto its target. A cold shiver ran through the hallway because some of the older guards remembered this scene. Not here, but the night Detective Miller died. Shadow had growled the same exact way at the same exact man. Dalton tore his eyes away from the dog. "Get him out of here now." But his voice cracked, and Shadow, with one final low growl, confirmed what no one else dared say aloud. He knew something. He remembered something, and whatever it was, it had just found its way back into this prison. The visitation chamber was colder than Luke remembered any room ever feeling. A single metal table sat in the center, bolted to the floor, with two chairs facing each other like opponents waiting for a duel. The walls were bare. The cameras watched everything, and the guards, 6 of them, lined the perimeter with hands resting on their belts, ready for anything. Luke sat alone at the table, his wrists cuffed, his breathing shallow. He had tried to prepare himself for this moment, but nothing could steady the storm inside him. After years of separation, after nights of fear, regret, and unanswered questions, he was finally about to see Shadow again. He closed his eyes. "Please let him remember me," he prayed silently. "Please." The door opened. Boots stepped in first, then Ramirez, then Alish, and then Shadow. Luke's breath caught in his throat. The dog who had saved his life more times than he could count walked into the room with the confidence of a soldier and the soul of an old friend who hadn't forgotten a single memory. His fur was grayer now, his movements slower, but his eyes, those eyes were exactly the same. Luke stood up instinctively, the chains rattling loudly. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice breaking. Shadow heard his name. He turned toward Luke. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, the world felt still. Shadow took one step forward, 2. Luke's heart pounded, but then Shadow stopped. His ears shot back. His body stiffened. A growl climbed slowly out of his throat, reverberating through the room like distant thunder. Luke froze. "Shadow." "Hey, it's me." "It's okay, buddy." But Shadow wasn't looking at him. He was staring behind Luke. The guards stiffened instantly. Dalton stood near the back wall, arms crossed, face pale. He hadn't expected to be assigned to the visitation chamber. He had tried to swap shifts, tried to avoid being anywhere near the dog. But fate was cruel, or perhaps justice was, and Shadow recognized him. The growl deepened. The retired K9 lowered his head, fur rising along his spine. The leash strained as Ramirez tried to pull him back. "Shadow, hey, stop!" Ramirez hissed. But Shadow lunged forward, teeth bared, not at Luke, but toward Dalton. The guards erupted. "Grab him! Hold the leash! Control the dog!" Chairs scraped, boots stomped, hands tightened on batons. But in the chaos, Luke's eyes widened, not in fear, but realization. Shadow wasn't attacking at random. He wasn't confused. He wasn't reacting like an old dog overwhelmed by emotion. He was identifying a target, a threat, the same threat he had sensed the night Miller was murdered. Dalton stepped back quickly, hitting the wall. Sweat trickled down his neck. "What's wrong with that stupid animal?" he shouted, voice cracking at the edges. Shadow barked, a sharp, violent sound that echoed off the walls. Every guard flinched. Luke whispered, "He remembers." Dalton's eyes flicked from Shadow to Luke, then to the exit, calculating his escape, his options, his lies. But it was too late. The silence in the room wasn't just fear. It was truth rising from the shadows. And for the first time since his conviction, Luke felt something inside him shift, hope. Because Shadow wasn't here for a goodbye. He was here to reveal what the world had refused to see. The room was chaos. Guards shouting, the leash pulled so tight, Ramirez's knuckles turned white. But Shadow didn't relent. His growl vibrated through the floor, deep and controlled, the kind of sound only a trained K9 made when identifying a direct threat. Not confusion, not fear, recognition. Dalton pressed himself against the wall, chest heaving. "Get that animal away from me," he barked, but his voice quivered, betraying him. A thin tremble ran through his fingers as he clutched his clipboard like a shield. Luke, still cuffed, stepped as close as he could, eyes locked on Dalton. "Shadow never growls without reason," he said quietly, but his voice carried through the room like a challenge. "Not once in all the years I handled him." Dalton glared back, jaw tight. "He's old. Dogs get confused. He doesn't know what he's doing." Shadow barked sharply, one loud, commanding snap of sound that made every guard flinch. Luke shook his head slowly. He knows exactly what he's doing. Ramirez struggled to pull Shadow back, but the dog kept lunging forward, claws scraping against the floor, attention fixed entirely on Dalton. His reactions weren't random. They were patterned, controlled, trained. This was not aggression. This was identification. Officer Bell stepped closer, voice low. "Dalton, did you ever work with Shadow? He's acting like he recognizes your scent." Dalton stiffened. "What? No, I barely even saw the dog." "That's not true," Luke cut in, eyes narrowing. "Shadow barked at you the night Miller died. You remember that, don't you?" A ripple went through the guards. Dalton's face tightened. He barked at everyone that night. There was blood everywhere. Anyone would have. Shadow growled again, louder. Luke's voice sharpened. "He barked at you in the interrogation room, too. Every time you walked in. Every single time." Silence. Ramirez frowned, glancing down at the dog. "K9s don't forget scent patterns. If Shadow reacted to him, then—" He swallowed. "He's reacting for the same reason now." Dalton's eyes darted around the room as if searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. But the officers who once treated him like a respected colleague now watched him with suspicion, creeping into their eyes. Officer Patel stepped nearer to Luke. "Is what he's saying true? Did Shadow react to Dalton during the investigation?" Luke nodded once. He did. He kept pulling toward him, growling. "I tried to tell internal affairs, but they dismissed it. Said a dog's behavior wasn't evidence." Dalton slammed his palm on the table. "This is ridiculous." But no one moved. No one spoke. Because the more he yelled, the more his mask cracked, and the more Shadow reacted. Luke leaned forward, chains rattling. Shadow knows the truth. He always did. But no one listened. Dalton took a step toward the exit. Too fast, too deliberate. Shadow lunged so violently the leash ripped from Ramirez's hand. Guards shouted, scrambling. Luke's voice rose over the chaos. "Shadow isn't confused. He's pointing at the real killer." Dalton froze. Everyone saw it. And the truth, buried for years, finally began to crack open. For a split second, the entire room froze. The kind of silence so sharp it felt like glass suspended in midair. Shadow's leash lay on the floor, slipped from Ramirez's grip. His body was low, muscles coiled, eyes locked on Dalton with a focus so intense every guard felt their pulse spike. Then Shadow lunged. Dalton screamed, an unfiltered sound of fear, stumbling backward as the dog launched straight toward him. Two guards jumped forward, but they were too slow. Shadow wasn't attacking wildly. He moved with precision, driven by instinct sharpened through years of training. His jaws clamped not on Dalton's flesh, but on the cuff of his uniform, yanking him violently to the ground. "Get him off! Get him off!" Dalton shrieked, kicking wildly. But Shadow didn't bite deeper. He wasn't trying to maul him. He was restraining him. Just like he had been trained to do when detaining a dangerous suspect. Chaos exploded. Guards scrambled, trying to separate them without hurting Shadow. Luke, despite being cuffed, stepped forward instinctively. "Shadow, hold!" he shouted, the command engraved into the dog's memory. Shadow obeyed instantly. He released Dalton, but stayed planted in front of him, head low, body blocking any attempt to stand. The growl rumbling from his chest was steady, controlled. A K-9 warning that said, "You're not going anywhere." Dalton wheezed, scrambling backward until he hit the wall. Sweat coated his forehead, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Officer Bell pointed at Dalton's leg. "Wait, what's that?" All eyes dropped. Blood. A thin trail of fresh blood stained Dalton's pant leg, and Shadow's teeth had never touched his skin. Ramirez crouched down, eyes narrowing. "Shadow didn't bite you. So where's that blood coming from?" Dalton pressed a hand over his thigh instinctively, too fast, too defensive. Patel stepped forward. "Dalton, why are you bleeding?" Dalton's breaths came short and sharp. I cut myself earlier. It's nothing, just a scratch." But his voice cracked, and then Shadow moved again, slowly, deliberately. The dog sniffed the air, nose twitching, moving closer to Dalton's pocket. He bumped it once with his snout, then growled. Patel reached forward. "Empty your pockets." Dalton's eyes widened. "No, there's no reason. Empty your pockets," Bell commanded. Hands shaking violently, Dalton pulled out a set of keys, then a pen, then a folded piece of cloth stained with dried brownish-red marks. Ramirez's eyes widened. "Is that Miller's blood?" Dalton flinched. He had tried to toss every piece of evidence, but one relic, one mistake, had stayed buried in his uniform for years. A trophy or a curse? A deathly chill swept the room. Luke stared at the cloth, breath stolen from his lungs. "Shadow tried to track that scent the night Miller died," he whispered. He kept pulling toward Dalton, over and over. Dalton's face collapsed into panic. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't mean—" But guilt spilled from his features before the words left his mouth. Shadow barked sharply once, and the room understood. This wasn't a dog acting out of emotion. This wasn't confusion. This was identification. Dalton wasn't just connected to the murder, he was the murderer. And Shadow, old, gray, retired, had just exposed a truth that the entire justice system had ignored. The room was a storm of voices, guards radioing in codes, footsteps pounding down the hallway, officers scrambling to restrain Dalton as he sank further into panic. Shadow was pulled back gently by Ramirez, though the dog's eyes never left the man he had been trying to warn them about for years. Warden Harris burst through the door, breath tight, eyes wide. What the hell happened in here? Officer Bell stepped forward, holding the stained cloth like a piece of radioactive material. "Warden." Dalton had this in his pocket. His voice trembled. "It matches the initial report from Detective Miller's crime scene." Harris stared at the cloth, confusion morphing into something darker. "That case is 8 years old." Luke lifted his chained wrists slightly. Shadow tried to alert us back then. No one believed him. Dalton thrashed against the wall as 2 guards pinned him. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't mean for Turner to take the fall." The confession hit the room like a thunderclap. Harris snapped. "Secure him. Now." 2 officers cuffed Dalton as he continued rambling, panic pouring out in bursts. "He threatened to expose me. Miller found out about the money. He was going to report me. I panicked. I didn't think Turner was just there. It was easy." The air thickened. Luke felt as though the world was tilting beneath him. It wasn't just a confession. It was proof. Ramirez knelt beside Shadow, stroking his graying fur. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" he whispered. "You knew all along." Shadow let out a low, tired breath. Harris straightened, the weight of a terrible realization settling on his shoulders. "Get internal affairs on the line and call the state attorney's office. We're reopening the case." His voice hardened. "This execution is halted until further notice." Luke felt his legs weaken. Hope, raw and overwhelming, flooded through him like oxygen after drowning. "Warden, please. Shadow has been trying to say this for years." Harris turned to him, face grave. "Turner, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you your life back." The guards looked shaken, some ashamed. Patel cleared his throat. "Warden, we need to move fast. If Dalton's telling the truth, the original investigation was contaminated from the start." Harris nodded sharply. "We're assembling a full investigative team right now." For the first time since he'd been dragged into this prison, Luke felt the chains on his wrists as something temporary, something that might finally come off. Shadow nudged his leg gently, eyes soft, and Luke understood. The dog hadn't come to say goodbye. He had come to finish the job he started the night Miller died. Dalton sat in the interrogation room with his wrists cuffed to the metal table, sweat dripping from his temples, breath shaking like a man drowning above water. The room, normally silent and controlled, felt charged with something electric, truth clawing its way to the surface after years of being buried alive. Warden Harris, Internal Affairs Agent Morales, and two detectives stood across from him. Files were stacked on the table. Old evidence, photos, reports full of lies masked as facts. And Shadow sat outside the glass window, watching through the narrow gap, eyes fixed on Dalton like a judge waiting for a verdict. Morales leaned forward. "Dalton, this is your one chance to tell the truth. If you lie now, every officer in this building will testify against you." Dalton's jaw clenched. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, voice barely holding steady. "Miller confronted me. He found out about the money I was taking from seized evidence. He said he'd report me. I snapped. I didn't plan it. It just happened." "Then why frame Turner?" Harris demanded, voice low and tight. Dalton shut his eyes. "Because it was easy." The room stiffened. Dalton continued, words tumbling out like a dam breaking. Turner was already at odds with Miller that day. Everyone knew about their argument. And Turner, he was clean, too clean. I knew investigators would never question evidence pointing at him. They trusted me more. "You planted the weapon," Morales said. Dalton nodded slowly. "I put it in his truck, wiped it, set everything up so it pointed to him. By the time backup arrived, the narrative was already in place." Detective Reynolds slammed his hand on the table. "You let an innocent man rot on death row?" Dalton flinched. I thought the case would close and no one would dig deeper. Turner would be gone, and the corruption trail would die with him." Harris stared at him with a mix of disgust and heartbreak. "You destroyed a good man's life, and you nearly let him die for your crime." Dalton's shoulders sagged. "I know." Outside the window, Shadow growled softly. Just once, not out of aggression, but recognition, as if confirming, "This is the truth I tried to show you." Morales stood straight. "We're reopening the case. With this confession and the physical evidence you kept, Turner will be exonerated." Dalton's breath hitched. "So, what happens to me?" Reynolds leaned close. "You get what you gave Luke Turner." The door opened. Two officers entered. Dalton's fate was sealed. As he was escorted out, Shadow rose to his feet, tail lifting slightly, eyes never leaving the man he had identified from the very beginning. Justice was finally shifting, and Luke Turner's freedom was no longer a distant dream. It had just become inevitable. Luke sat in the holding room outside the warden's office, hands still cuffed but heart beating differently, lighter, faster, as if it finally remembered what hope felt like. For hours he'd waited in silence while investigators tore open the old case, cross-checked Dalton's confession and compared the evidence Shadow had exposed. Every minute felt like a lifetime. Shadow lay beside him, his head resting on Luke's boot. His breathing was slower now, but steady. Luke gently ran his fingers behind the dog's ear, something he hadn't done in years. "You never gave up on me," he whispered. "Not once." The door opened. Warden Harris stepped out, followed by Morales, Reynolds, and Patel. Their faces told the truth before their words ever did. Harris cleared his throat, voice thick. "Luke Turner, after reviewing Dalton's confession, the contaminated evidence, and the documents he concealed, your conviction is vacated. Effective immediately, you are a free man." Luke's breath left his body in a single, soundless exhale. His knees weakened, and for a moment he couldn't move. The cuffs were removed, clattering against the table like chains falling off his life. Reynolds stepped forward. "You deserve an apology. From all of us." Luke shook his head slowly. "What I deserve doesn't matter. What matters is the truth finally came out." Shadow nudged his leg, tail tapping gently against the floor. Harris knelt beside the dog. "This old boy is the real hero. If he hadn't reacted today, we might have executed an innocent man." His voice wavered. "He saved your life." Luke looked at Shadow, eyes glistening. "He always has." The officers escorted Luke through the hallway. This time, not as an inmate, but as a man reclaiming his life. Inmates pressed against cell bars, whispering the news. Guards nodded respectfully as he passed. Outside, the sky was gold with a setting sun. Warm, bright, alive. It felt like freedom. Shadow stepped beside him, slower than before, leaning against Luke's leg as they walked. When they reached the gates, a soft breeze carried the scent of grass, dirt, and open air. Scents Shadow had lived for. Luke knelt beside him. "We made it, buddy," he whispered, voice breaking. "We're finally out." Shadow licked his hand once, then rested his head against Luke's chest. For a long moment, they stayed like that, the world quiet around them, time holding its breath. But then Luke noticed something. Shadow's breathing wasn't steady now. It was shallow, weak. "Hey, Shadow," Luke whispered in panic. "Hey, buddy, stay with me." Ramirez hurried forward, concern on his face. "He's old, Luke. This was a lot for him." Shadow blinked slowly, eyes soft, full of peace, not fear. Luke held him close, tears falling freely now. "Don't go, not yet." Shadow exhaled a warm, gentle breath against Luke's chest, then another, weaker, and with one final look filled with love, loyalty, and a silent message. "You're free now. My job is done." Shadow's body relaxed, his tail stilled, his eyes closed. Luke pulled him tightly into his arms and broke. Shadow had given him one last gift, the truth, his life back, and his final breath in the arms of the man he loved to the very end. The world felt impossibly still as Luke held Shadow's lifeless body in his arms. The prison yard, once filled with noise and tension, now faded into a soft blur of wind and distant sirens. Officers who had once stared at Luke with suspicion now stood with their heads bowed, hats against their chests, honoring the fallen K-9 who had done what no human dared, speak the truth. Luke pressed his forehead against Shadow's, tears soaking into the dog's gray fur. "You saved me," he whispered, voice trembling, even at the end. "You saved me." Ramirez placed a gentle hand on Luke's shoulder. "He waited for you," he said quietly. "He held on until he knew you were free." Luke nodded, though the ache in his chest only tightened. "I wish I could have saved him too." "You did," Ramirez replied softly. "You gave him what he wanted most. The chance to finish his job. The chance to see you again." A small ceremony was arranged outside the prison gates, informal but heartfelt. Officers from Luke's old department came, some ashamed, some grieving. Shadow was wrapped in a flag, his K-9 badge placed gently over his heart. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in golden crimson, Luke whispered a final goodbye. "I'll make sure no one forgets you," he vowed. "I'll spend the rest of my life honoring what you fought for." Days later, Luke sat in a quiet cemetery, staring at the polished stone now marking Shadow's resting place. Shadow, K-9 officer, loyal to the last breath. Beside it, Luke placed Shadow's old metal ID tag, the same one he had carried throughout his imprisonment. It gleamed faintly in the morning light. "Everything I am," Luke murmured, "I owe to you." He stayed there for hours, until the wind finally whispered through the trees, carrying a strange comfort, as if Shadow's spirit lingered nearby, keeping watch the way he always had. In the weeks that followed, Luke didn't disappear into obscurity. He couldn't. Something inside him had shifted, not just because he'd been freed, but because Shadow's sacrifice demanded more than silence. Luke began speaking publicly about wrongful convictions. He met with advocacy groups, gave interviews, and pushed for reforms in the justice system. Reporters asked him what kept him going. "My partner," Luke always replied. "He spent his entire life protecting the innocent. I'm just continuing what he started." The story of Shadow quickly spread beyond their town. News stations picked it up. Newspapers printed headlines honoring the heroic K-9 who solved the murder that shook a department. People who had never met Shadow wept reading the story, moved by the unbreakable loyalty of a dog who outperformed an entire justice system. Luke eventually founded an organization dedicated to supporting retired K-9s, medical care, training support, proper homes after service. He named it the Shadow Foundation. Every plaque, every brochure, every rescued K-9 bore Shadow's face, his legacy living on in every life Luke touched. 1 year later, Luke returned to Shadow's grave. He knelt, placing a fresh bouquet beside the headstone. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. "They know the truth now. They remember you." Soft breeze rustled the leaves. Luke smiled through his tears. Shadow may have taken his final breath that day, but his spirit never left. It lived in truth. It lived in justice. It lived in every heartbeat of the man he saved, and it would live forever. This story teaches the power of loyalty, truth, and justice. True friendship, like the bond between Luke and Shadow, transcends obstacles, fear, and time. Shadow's unwavering instinct and courage exposed the truth when humans failed, showing that integrity and vigilance matter. Luke's journey reminds us that patience, faith, and perseverance can overcome injustice, and that even in the darkest circumstances, one act of honesty or bravery can change lives. Most importantly, it highlights the value of compassion, responsibility, and standing for what is right, inspiring us to defend the innocent and honor those who protect and guide us.